Welcome to Unit 5, Heresies, False Teachings, and Imperial Leadership. This unit will be discussing perhaps one of the most significant events in church history. You'll remember that up to this point, Christianity was considered by the religious and political power of the time, whether it be the Jewish court or the Roman Empire, at best a minor inconvenience, at worst a major threat. That was highlighted in our discussion several chapters ago when we talked about persecution. In this unit, we want to return to the story of Rome and its persecution of the Christians. It's going to come full circle. But before we go any further, let's do a quick review of the development of Scripture in the first 3 centuries of the church from our last unit. In our last unit, we briefly examined the question of how the early church established its canon or sacred Scripture. During the first 3 centuries of the church, a major theme was that of persecution and its effects on the development of Christian thought and practice. Now, when considering the history of the New Testament, Roman oppression absolutely must serve as a backdrop for these major turning events. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, church leadership, as we've already talked about, was heavily targeted, and thus many churches went without elders, elders being those who had the credentials of the apostles or had been trained by the apostles. Now remember how we talked about churches naturally believed that those who knew the apostles or had received the apostles' authority or teaching were put into leadership. Well, how do you deal with the fact that most of your men who were trained by the apostles or someone who knew an apostle were being killed off? You all of a sudden don't have the kind of leadership that you would need. So naturally the church began to collect letters that had apostolic authority. This was a very organic process. We talked about it last time. The church collected these writings associated with the apostles. This desire to collect writing really isn't any different from many of the collections that you find today, whether it be writing or music from deceased popular figures. Even just in the last few years, we've seen the death of Michael Jackson or Prince, and subsequently a surge in their popularity, and with that, a desire to establish a canon of their best works. Of course, anyone might have a missing work of one of those influential figures, and then taken the opportunity to try to sell that work, whether it be a poem or a book or some sort of lyrics, music, to say, oh yes, I have a missing work of this famous author, a famous musician, famous poet. So that is very natural for humans to consider that question. Okay, so the question then for the earliest Christians are, now that John and Peter and the Apostle Paul and their immediate successors are dead, partly due to persecution, as we've mentioned, how do we really know what Jesus taught? How do we know what genuinely have apostolic authority? Thus, the church began the process of collecting and categorizing all the works about Jesus and the apostles. Now, you'll notice on the screen here, the 3 general categories were Scripture, works determined to have been written by or associated with closely to an apostle. Okay? New Testament Gospels being a primary example of that. Devotional works, works that reflect the general truths of the apostles, but the community, through a process of discernment, realized they were not written by the apostles, or were heretical works, works written in the 3rd category here, like the Gospel of Judas. They're written claiming to have been written by an apostle, but their teachings very much did not line up with the traditions of the Jews or the traditions that the early church was very familiar with. They were new ideas coming in, and often they were dated later, post 100 AD. These were believed to be false gospels, such as the Gospel of Judas. They used the ideas of Christianity to gain popularity, but were not really Christian or Jewish concepts. Thus, the church rejected them, and we saw that all in our last unit. Thus, we end up with the New Testament writings, the Didache and the Gospel of Judas, which we've talked about before. My hope is that in your research and reading of the Didache and the Gospel of Judas, you'll show you that, just in this brief experience, that the early church had determined the validity, how they determined the validity of the New Testament canon. At least that you would see how thoroughly not Jewish, and in really ways, the book of Judas is not connected to the Jesus tradition that you're familiar with, or the early Christians would have been familiar with. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now for this unit, I'd like us to return to our typical format of analyzing an image as a starting point for understanding major turning points in church history. Now, if we had, considering our last unit, if we had used the chart, you certainly would have seen these major ideas appear in our discussion about the canon. What is truth? Where does truth come from? The role of literature would have been very, very important. And of course, when we looked at Gnosticism, the nature of good and evil, is the material world in itself evil? That would have been the Gnostic teaching. So let's return back to this chart for our next unit. And here we go. So the first image, I'm just going to give it to you without giving any clues other than one stated on the bottom. If you wanted to pause right here, this will be our first stopping point. So notice, take some notes. Chi-Rho, this term should lead you to this event and to the major character that you will also see played in this next image. And there he is. And if you search the word Arius, this also would hopefully get you in the direction that you need to go. Now, as usual, I don't want to give away too much, so we're just going to leave you with those two clues. Here's the chart that I want us to spend some time with for this particular unit. Again, looking at those two images and those major events and the characters that are portrayed in there, one character in particular, let's look at philosophy, or the nature of truth, and theology, which is deeply connected, politics, and geography. And right away, you're going to start to see how significant those themes are when dealing with the individual in the images and the major events that portrayed, those two events portrayed in those stories. Okay, here's your directions. Again, you can do a PowerPoint or a Prezi or a paper. Either way, we'll be in discussion during one of our times together. You need to identify and summarize the events in the image. You know how to do that. And then you need to discuss the significance of these events in relationships to the themes that we highlighted earlier: philosophy, theology, politics, and geography. If you've forgotten how to do that, please go back to the earlier units or the paperwork that I provided that highlight some of the key questions that you should look at when considering those themes. And finally here, similar to what we've done, just make it a big point here, please connect at least 3 major points from this unit to other units that we've discussed. Whether it's Unit 1, looking at the bookends between Titus and Luther, certainly there's connections there, but subsequent chapters are units as well, major points of connecting to these major turning events for the church. And you're going to see why as soon as you dive into those images and begin to figure out what's going on. As usual, please email me, please come by my room, whatever it might take. I don't want to be part of the discussion. All right?